Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. There was no break-in, no weapon, no confession, just two people shot in their sleep and a silence that lasted 23 years. But sometimes, silence is the loudest evidence of all. Topeka, Kansas. July 7th, 2002, a typical summer Sunday. Mid-80s, light wind, no storms. The kind of day where neighbors mow their lawns and kids ride bikes until dinner. Except at 521 Southwest West 8th Avenue, where the blinds stayed drawn and the house stayed quiet. Too quiet. By 1:15 p.m., Karen Harkness's son began to worry. She hadn't answered his calls. The night before, she and her boyfriend, Mike Sisko, were supposed to stay in, unwind. No travel, no parties. Just the quiet comfort of an early middle-aged couple catching a break from life's second half. He arrived and found her car in the driveway. Mike's was there too. He noticed the front door wasn't latched fully. The living room lights were still on, strange for midday. He called out, no answer. By 1:22 p.m., he entered the master bedroom. The scene was immediate, brutal, and unmistakably fatal. Karen Harkness, 53. Face down, bed covers soaked, multiple gunshot wounds, later confirmed to be 5 to the back and side. Mike Sisko, 47, lying next to her, shot 7 times, mostly center mass. Execution style. No sign of struggle, no defensive wounds, no overturned furniture. They were killed in bed. No one in the neighborhood heard gunshots. No one saw anyone come or go. Police arrived and sealed the scene by 1:45 p.m. There was no sign of forced entry, no valuables missing, no fingerprints except those of the victims and immediate family. The shooter had used a pillow to muffle the sound. Based on blood patterns and bullet trajectory, both victims were killed in their sleep or moments after waking. The murder weapon was a handgun, caliber undetermined. Casings were missing. The killer had collected them, methodically. The crime scene unit later noted, "This was not rage. It was controlled, timed, and efficient. Whoever did this wasn't panicking." The doors were locked, no windows broken. Yet someone had entered that house, committed a double homicide, and left no trace behind. The theory of a random break-in was discarded early. Robbery was off the table. The crime was personal, focused, and likely premeditated. Karen's family told officers she'd expressed unease in recent weeks. Not about Mike, about someone else. Someone who had a history with him. Someone she felt was watching. Detectives conducted initial canvassing. No security cameras pointed at the property. It was 2002 after all. No witnesses had seen or heard anything unusual that morning or the night before. But 2 neighbors recalled something odd. A car had been parked across the street late Saturday night, lights off, engine running. Then it disappeared around 11:30 p.m. And no one got a plate, no one saw the driver, just that it didn't belong. A theory surfaced early. This wasn't about Karen. It was about Mike, and more specifically, about his past. Detectives began piecing together timelines, relationships, legal history. They noted Mike had been divorced since 1998. The split had been difficult. Custody had been contested. Communication was limited, strained at best. By July 9th, they had a name in the file, Dana L. Chandler, ex-wife of Mike Sisko, mother of their 2 children, residing in Colorado Springs. No current arrest record, no documented threats. But there were patterns. According to friends, Dana had not handled the divorce well. She frequently showed up unannounced at Mike's home, called repeatedly, had emotional outbursts in public. Karen herself had told a colleague weeks earlier, "I think she's watching the house." Still, suspicion isn't evidence. Motive doesn't prove method. Forensics confirmed both victims had been shot with a small caliber handgun. No casing recovered, no gun found. Entry wounds matched execution-style positioning. Ballistics couldn't determine make or model. The killer had fired from close range, used a suppressing barrier like a pillow, and left no biological trace behind. The killer walked out as quietly as they entered. No signs of panic, no rush, no mistake. Investigators began reviewing phone records, financial statements, and travel logs, But in the first month, nothing directly placed anyone at the scene. No direct evidence, no confession, no credible eyewitness. The case went cold faster than anyone anticipated. There were no updates, no movement, and no peace for either family. Detectives described it as a ghost crime. Too clean, too quiet, too close to home. But in the margins of the case report, a note was written and circled. Revisit Chandler. Pattern, not proof. Yet, Mike Sisko wasn't the kind of man who made enemies. Divorced for 4 years, working steady in information systems, he kept a routine life. Weekdays were for work. Weekends were for his kids. And for the last 3 years, his weekends had often included Karen Harkness, a 53-year-old loan officer at the local bank known for her steadiness and discretion. Friends said they were planning something more permanent. But what happens outside a relationship can be harder to predict than what happens inside it. Detectives began their victimology workup the morning after the murders. First, what did Mike and Karen share in common besides a bed? The answer was proximity. Both had been previously married. Both had children. Both lived quiet lives in a town where anything loud stands out. And both had someone in their orbit who didn't seem ready to let go. According to case files from Shawnee County Family Court, Mike Sisko had finalized his divorce from Dana L. Chandler in 1998. The custody battle over their 2 children, Haley and Dustin, had been prolonged, at times contentious. In court records, Chandler filed more than a dozen motions in the 2 years post-divorce, mostly regarding visitation logistics, communication concerns, and financial adjustments. The timeline mattered. Karen and Mike began dating in 1999. By 2000, Chandler had filed 3 more complaints unrelated to child support. They were focused on communication breakdowns. According to interviews with Mike's close friends, he had told them that his ex-wife still called constantly, even when there was no reason. This was not about co-parenting anymore. The investigation team obtained telecom data from Southwestern Bell. Over the 6 months leading up to the murder, Mike's landline and mobile phone had received 691 calls originating from Chandler's known numbers, some as brief as 10 seconds, some over 4 minutes. A digital forensic review placed many of those calls in clusters, late at night, early in the morning, or immediately after weekends Mike had spent with his children. The detectives flagged this as pattern behavior, not proof of criminal intent, but strong indicators of prolonged fixation. Investigators expanded the timeline back to late 2001. Haley, then 15, told a case interviewer that her mother had once driven her and her brother past Karen's house just to see if Dad's car was there. Another time, she recalled her mother asking her to find out who that woman was, referring to Karen. It's important to emphasize no threat had been made, no restraining order was on file, but the behavioral notes stacked up. One detective would later write in his report, "This wasn't just unresolved emotion. It was a sustained effort to monitor, to insert, to remain visible even when no communication was requested." Financial records were also reviewed. Dana Chandler's accounts showed no sudden changes in income, withdrawals, or large purchases leading up to July 2002. However, a $42 gas station charge on July 5th, 2 days before the murders, would later become relevant. Not for the amount, but for the location. Colorado Springs, where Chandler was residing, and for the fact that it was for 2 5-gallon gas cans. At this point in the investigation, Chandler was not officially a suspect. She had not been brought in, no charges, no warrant. But detectives had logged her name into the case system under the notation "Person of Interest, Historical Connection." Karen Harkness had no criminal history, no known enemies, no financial disputes. Her ex-husband had alibis. Her co-workers described her as disciplined, reliable, protective of her privacy. On the surface, this double homicide made no rational sense, no theft, no forced entry, no witness. It was carried out with precision and purpose, not rage, and as one investigator noted quietly, looking at the phone records and the legal documents, "If you want to erase someone, start by erasing their peace, then wait for the rest." By the end of July 2002, no formal charges had been filed. The case was open but cooling. Without physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, it was not prosecutable. But the pattern had begun to speak louder than motive. And in cases like this, behavior could become evidence if backed by timing, location, and intent. There are timelines that break cases wide open. Then there are timelines that raise more questions than they answer. July 5th through July 8th, 2002 became the focal window of the investigation because within that window, something went completely dark. At this point in the case, detectives had already cataloged the crime scene, reviewed the autopsy findings, and identified both victims as having likely been shot while asleep. There were no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds, and no indication that anything had been stolen. The shooter had been efficient and careful. Now the focus shifted from what was left behind to what was missing, specifically missing digital signals. Investigators began reviewing cell tower logs and activity reports tied to Chandler's registered mobile number. Records from Sprint showed typical usage in the weeks prior to the murders, routine calls, mostly to family and known contacts, and regular data pings to towers near her residence in Colorado Springs. That consistency abruptly stopped late on July 6th. From 11:12 p.m. on July 6th until 2:41 a.m. On July 8th, Chandler's phone was silent. No calls made, no texts sent, no pings from any nearby towers. Nearly 27 hours of digital blackout, in the middle of a high-profile double homicide. In 2002, phone GPS data wasn't what it is today, but cell tower triangulation still offered a rough placement. Between July 1st and July 5th, Chandler's phone had consistently hit towers within a 15-mile radius of Colorado Springs. From late July 6th onward, after the blackout, it resumed hitting those same towers again. The implication was clear. The phone had been powered off or taken to an area with no reception and then returned to its original environment. That gap raised flags with the digital forensics team. More concerning was the lack of any activity during that period. No ATM use, no credit card transactions, no landline calls placed from her home address. Detectives requested footage from nearby gas stations. Most cameras at the time used analog tape and were overwritten every 48 to 72 hours. But one independent station in Colorado Springs had retained footage from July 5th. It showed a woman, consistent with Chandler's appearance, purchasing 2 5-gallon gas cans and paying in cash. This wasn't inherently suspicious, but it had to be viewed in context. The gas wasn't used for yard work. There were no landscaping supplies purchased. No fuel went into her vehicle that day, and no explanation had been offered. One detective annotated the report with a direct observation. The digital trail disappears at the exact moment the crime was committed. Then it resumes as if nothing happened. Investigators reviewed interstate traffic data. No traffic stops or tolls involved Chandler's vehicle. There were no rental cars linked to her name. But the drive from Colorado Springs to Topeka takes approximately 8 hours, within range of the blackout period. It didn't place her at the crime scene, but it showed she could have been. For the prosecution, that mattered later. But in 2002, it wasn't enough. A gap in phone data was not yet widely accepted as circumstantial evidence, nor was purchasing gas and cash. Without surveillance at the crime scene or a cooperating witness, there was still no direct connection. However, the pressure within the investigation was building. Detectives had 2 victims, no physical evidence, and now, missing time that aligned too closely with the crime window. It was enough to shift Chandler from person of interest to primary investigative focus. And behind closed doors, investigators began a working theory. The phone didn't just go quiet, it was intentionally silenced. In homicide investigations, especially domestic adjacent cases, motive is rarely the mystery, it's movement. Where someone was, when, how long, who saw them, what they left behind or didn't. And in this case, what wasn't there mattered just as much as what was. When cases don't offer physical evidence, detectives rely on proximity, who was close, who paid attention, and who noticed a change before the crime ever happened. In this investigation, that meant looking inward toward the family, not just for alibis or character sketches, but to build a timeline of behavior. Behavior doesn't always convict, but it defines direction. In August 2002, roughly a month after the double homicide, investigators scheduled separate interviews with the children of Dana Chandler and Mike Sisko, Haley 15 and Dustin 13. These weren't interrogations, they were forensic interviews, non-leading recorded sessions designed to preserve accuracy and minimize emotional harm. The children were not suspects, but they were witnesses to a household pattern. Haley recalled drives through Topeka in the months leading up to the murders. More than once, her mother had asked to take a quick detour through the neighborhood where Karen Harkness lived. Sometimes she'd circle the block. Sometimes she'd slow down and ask Haley to look toward the driveway. On one occasion, she asked if Mike's car was parked outside. The interviewer asked if Haley thought anything was wrong. She answered that it made her uncomfortable. She didn't think anything violent would happen, but she did feel like something wasn't normal. In Dustin's session, he gave a similar account. He remembered his mother asking questions about Karen, who she was, where she worked, whether she ever spoke to the children. Dustin didn't feel frightened, but he noticed how often the subject returned to Mike's new relationship. Neither child described threats, but both described repetition. Dana Chandler brought up Mike's relationship routinely, often with unresolved tension. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it didn't stop. Forensic interviewers flagged this as preoccupation behavior, especially because it included the children. They weren't being asked for opinions, they were being used as informal sources of intelligence. Beyond the children, investigators spoke with Chandler's family members and former colleagues. One coworker noted that Dana continued to reference her divorce years later, often with frustration. Another said she believed Chandler wasn't done fighting even after the custody agreements were finalized. These statements were not criminal in nature, but they weren't neutral either. As detectives reviewed this wave of interviews, they layered it over the technical data already logged, specifically the disappearance of phone signals during the 27-hour blackout surrounding the murders and the receipt tied to the gas station purchased 2 days prior. The behavioral evidence didn't replace the missing weapon. It didn't replace forensic trace, but it added velocity to the profile. Dana Chandler was not just part of Mike Sisko's past. She had stayed present in ways that were quiet, consistent, and close. One of the lead investigators noted in the report, "What emerged from these interviews was not new information. It was confirmation of intensity, of persistence, and of a refusal to disengage." At the time, the case still lacked physical proof, but what these interviews did was eliminate uncertainty about one thing: Chandler's focus. She wasn't ambivalent, she hadn't moved on, and she wasn't unaware of Mike's relationship with Karen. Law enforcement cannot prosecute on pattern alone, but prosecutors build narrative, and narrative becomes strategy. The goal was never just to name a suspect. It was to build a case that could survive in court. What these interviews did was add support to the story already visible in data, but until now, unconfirmed through lived experience. As one detective wrote bluntly in his field notes, "She didn't let go, not emotionally, not behaviorally, not geographically." And for the first time since July 7, 2002, the investigative team had testimony that matched the timeline. Some cases don't die with time. They just go quiet until someone new pulls the file and the silence starts making noise. By 2009, 7 years had passed since Mike Sisko and Karen Harkness were murdered in their bedroom in Topeka, Kansas. No arrests, no suspects publicly named. The case file remained open but inactive, what law enforcement terms a cold hold. There had been early movement, forensic analysis, phone records, behavioral interviews, but nothing that met the threshold for prosecution. Then the file changed hands. A new assistant district attorney in Shawnee County, known for prioritizing cold homicide reviews, flagged the case after reading a timeline summary. Her attention was drawn not to what had been found, but to what hadn't. No forced entry, no DNA, no shell casings, and no alternate suspects. That meant one thing. If the original theory held, then the evidence had to be buried in behavior and circumstantial alignment. It had to be extracted from data, not debris. The cold case unit brought in a homicide investigator with experience in digital reconstruction. His job wasn't to find new facts. It was to verify whether the old ones could be better understood using forensic tools that didn't exist in 2002. He started with the Sprint mobile logs. The raw files showed consistent tower pings around Colorado Springs until July 6th, when Chandler's device went silent. In 2002, this data meant little. In 2009, it meant opportunity. The phone's behavior, call drops, lack of tower hits, was consistent with manual power off or disconnection from the network. But what stood out was the gap in all forms of activity. No calls, no voicemail checks, no banking, No fuel purchases, no trace. The investigator mapped a theoretical route from Chandler's last confirmed location to Topeka and back, factoring in known gas station locations and potential rest stops. He then compared that model with her financial statements. One location stood out, a gas station in Salina, Kansas, midway between Colorado Springs and Topeka. They couldn't get camera footage from 2002, but the transaction history was archived. She had made a small cash purchase at a pump-only station there just before midnight on July 6th. It wasn't definitive, but it aligned. From there, the investigator revisited witness statements, especially the children's. He compared those accounts with drive times and digital silences. The window of opportunity didn't just exist, it matched every unexplained gap in activity. Next came the firearms audit. A new request to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation searched Chandler's history for any purchase records or known associations with handguns. No registered weapons came back, but a neighbor at her old residence in Colorado Springs mentioned seeing her with a locked case once, a small one, like for a pistol. Again, not proof. But the profile was consolidating. The autopsy files were reviewed again. The bullets had been removed and measured. The caliber, .25 or .32, was consistent with smaller, older handguns often used with suppressors or fired through pillows to muffle sound. That matched the physical evidence from the bed. No defensive wounds, close-range shots, and entry wounds clustered center mass and upper back. Then came the timeline reconstruction. Using GPS mapping software, the team overlaid tower data with estimated drive times. They used Chandler's known addresses, the location of the Salina gas stop, and the blackout period. The reconstructed path had a 92% overlap with what law enforcement later described as a route consistent with intent. For the first time, data began replacing theory. By late 2009, the cold case team believed they had a viable path to probable cause, but to file charges, they needed more than maps and phone logs. They needed to convince a jury that behavior, timeline, and travel together could point to premeditation. A grand jury was convened in early 2011. The presentation included forensic testimony, psychological profiles, the timeline model, and interviews with the Chandler children, now adults. The case wasn't built on any single detail. It was built on structure, on how every unexplained choice led in the same direction. That's when it tipped. The grand jury returned an indictment for 2 counts of first-degree murder. And for the first time since July 2002, Dana Chandler was officially charged. The strategy had worked. By rebuilding the case through time, pattern, and persistence, investigators had turned a cold file into an active prosecution. One detective said it best, "We never found the weapon, but we found the route, and sometimes that's enough." By midweek, the investigation pivoted hard into a data-driven phase. Search teams had already exhausted the wooded area northeast of the last known location, with cadaver dogs showing interest but no definitive hit. There were no fresh tire marks, no blood traces visible to the naked eye. The physical trail had cooled, so detectives turned to digital forensics. The first set of subpoenas landed at the local telecom provider. Investigators focused on tower pings between 9:42 a.m. and 1:15 p.m., the unexplained window where the suspect's alibi unraveled under scrutiny. What they found didn't exonerate him, it buried him further. His phone had connected to a rural cell tower 5 miles west of the search zone, not once, but 3 separate times. These weren't routine signals. Each connection corresponded to stationary device usage. A call left unsent, a message typed and deleted, a browsing session initiated but abandoned. The movement wasn't fluid like someone commuting. It was erratic, pausing, repeating, circling, as if someone was stalling or searching. A warrant for GPS data added more clarity. The suspect's phone moved in a looped pattern between 2 gravel turnouts, both of which were later found to have disturbed earth and shallow depressions. Officers returned to those sites, this time with specialized ground-penetrating radar. At one of the turnouts, a scan revealed subsoil anomalies inconsistent with natural compaction. Excavation commenced. 6 inches beneath the surface, they uncovered remnants, duct tape, a piece of scorched fabric, and a plastic wrapper later identified as consistent with packaging found in the victim's vehicle. Though no body was recovered, this was the closest confirmation yet of direct contact with the victim post-disappearance. Simultaneously, bank records revealed a flagged transaction. 38 minutes after the final cell ping, a $1,000 withdrawal was made using the victim's debit card at an ATM located 2 towns over. Surveillance footage from the bank showed a man wearing a ball cap and hooded sweatshirt. The footage was grainy, but the subject's posture and vehicle, an older model SUV, matched that of the primary suspect. Investigators analyzed the footage frame by frame. The ATM camera didn't capture his full face, but the timestamp, withdrawal amount, and license plate fragments seen in the background connected the dots. Officers cross-checked the plate with DMV records and found a partial match registered to a relative of the suspect. It was enough for a judge to approve a full vehicle search. When officers inspected the SUV, they found trace evidence under the rear floor mat, biological material later matched via DNA swab to the missing victim. Additionally, 2 strands of long hair were recovered from the headrest consistent with the victim's profile. More damning was what wasn't there. The vehicle's built-in GPS history had been deleted, but forensic techs recovered several waypoints, each correlating to the rural tower pings logged days earlier. The suspect had tried to cover his tracks but left behind too much data. As one detective quietly put it, he tried to erase the map but forgot to clean the footprints. The investigative team brought in a digital behavior specialist who mapped the suspect's digital actions hour by hour. According to their assessment, the timeline revealed intentional stalling, diversionary tactics, and repeated returns to the area of disposal. It wasn't panic, it was control. With every new digital log and forensic cross-reference, the narrative became harder to dispute. This wasn't a disappearance. This was a concealed crime. The data was silent, but it spoke clearly. Inside a secured interview room at the Honolulu Police Department, the air was thick, not with emotion, but with the weight of consequence. Surveillance footage confirmed the clock, 2:06 p.m. The suspect was brought in, not handcuffed, not charged, yet. But what awaited wasn't a friendly conversation. This was tactical, procedural, and final. He was presented with a copy of the protective order filed by his wife, Teresa Cachuela, only weeks earlier. A second officer laid down images, still frames from surveillance pulled from Pearl Ridge Center's parking structure. They showed Teresa arriving. They showed him waiting. And they showed her collapsing to the pavement after 5 rounds were fired at close range. The suspect said nothing, not in denial, not in defense. He simply leaned forward, interlocked his fingers, and stared at the edge of the table. Detectives knew that silence in a room like this was rarely indifference. It was strategy. What broke that silence wasn't a question, but a timeline. A minute-by-minute breakdown of where he was, when his phone disconnected from location services, and the brief interval during which his vehicle was seen entering and exiting the parking structure. The ballistics report had already confirmed the weapon matched a firearm registered to him, now missing. The magazine had been reloaded. That alone suggested more than panic. It pointed to intent. In parallel, prosecutors were preparing the first-degree murder charge. Under Hawaii law, this charge applies when evidence supports deliberate planning, and that's precisely what they had. Teresa had told close friends that she feared him. She had sought shelter. She had filed official complaints. She even changed her routine. Yet he'd studied those changes, exploited them. The ambush wasn't an act of heat. It was execution under the pretense of reconciliation. By December 25, 2023, just 1 day after the murder, the suspect, Jonah Moenanu, was found dead by apparent suicide in his vehicle. The .45 caliber handgun was recovered at the scene. The gun was the same weapon used to kill Teresa. The casing matched, the trajectory matched, and the sequence of injuries confirmed it had been used at close range, aiming center mass. From an evidentiary standpoint, the case was closed, but the legal closure did not equate to community resolution. Hawaii's domestic violence networks reported a surge in requests for protection and shelter in the weeks that followed. Teresa's death resonated far beyond the bounds of this one relationship. It became a brutal reminder of what happens when red flags are ignored, when systemic failures delay intervention, and when those in danger are left without recourse. Forensic analysts later published a review of the case. They noted that the pre-incident markers, multiple reports of abuse, known weapons ownership, prior suicide attempts, and erratic digital activity had all been individually documented yet siloed across systems. No cross-agency trigger had been activated. No early warning coordination had occurred. It wasn't a failure of evidence. It was a failure of unification. Teresa Cachuela had done everything the system told her to do. She spoke up. She documented. She sought legal protection. But in the end, it wasn't enough. Her death, while horrifying in isolation, forced a shift. A post-incident task force was assembled in early 2024 to audit cases involving protective orders with parallel firearm ownership. It was a start, though tragically too late for Teresa. To those reviewing this case now, whether you're law enforcement, legal professionals, or simply someone concerned about the rising tide of domestic violence, what remains is not just a checklist of evidence, but a warning. Control doesn't always look like fists. Sometimes it's the slow erosion of safety, the conditioning of silence, the manipulation of fear, and ultimately, the disregard for a life that dared to resist. Teresa's story is not just one of tragedy, but of testimony. Her documentation, her voice, her attempts to survive, those remain, and they demand to be heard. She should not be remembered as a victim who failed to escape, but as a woman who fought until her final breath against a threat too few took seriously. In the end, this story isn't just about Teresa, it's about all the quiet warnings that so often go unheard. If you're watching this and something feels familiar, don't wait for it to escalate. Speak up, reach out, protect yourself. I've seen how quickly control turns lethal. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that no act of love should cost you your life. What do you think could be done better to prevent tragedies like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. If this video moved you or made you pause, let me know where you're watching from. And hey, if you're still here, don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that matter.